So people have been debating for years, should we go back to apartheid? Is everything really better now that apartheid's over, or is everything worse? So I decided to do some research to find out if things really have gotten worse in a post-apartheid South Africa, or if everything's better. The short answer is, most things have gotten better, some things have gotten worse, but the most important aspects have gotten better since apartheid ended. The most obvious improvement is in terms of democracy, freedom, and human rights. During apartheid, South Africa was an authoritarian state run by a white supremacist far-right government, where only the white minority had any human rights. Only white people were allowed to vote. The government made sure that white people had access to the best schooling and the best education. Neighborhoods were completely segregated. People of color were kicked out of their homes and their homes were given to whites. White people were allowed to live in the richest, most developed urban areas, while black people were forced to live in poor, segregated townships. Even things like beaches and benches were segregated, where white people were always given access to the best of these things. And apartheid was just a crime against humanity. Today in South Africa, all of the apartheid laws have been repealed. We now have multiracial neighborhoods, multiracial couples, multiracial beaches, multiracial schools, and a multiracial government. Now everyone is allowed to vote and have their voice heard, and not just the minority. We now have freedom of speech, and all South Africans are allowed to protest without fear of being imprisoned or executed by the government. Well, there was Marikana, which was probably the worst atrocity of post-apartheid South Africa, but for the most part we are now a democratic and free society. We're allowed to criticize the government as much as we want. You have people all over social media constantly insulting the government or making fun of the government with cartoons. And South Africans don't just go missing or get imprisoned for 20 years for talking shit about the government. South Africa is consistently ranked as one of the most democratic countries in Africa. We do need to be grateful for how lucky we are to be in a democracy, because a large proportion of the world does not live in a democracy, and democracies are very difficult to build and they can easily collapse. So we went from an authoritarian apartheid state with human rights for only one group to now being a free and democratic liberal democracy. Now some people might point out, well, what about corruption? Look how bad corruption's gotten under the ANC. And yes, corruption is a very big problem in South Africa. Corruption was probably at its highest during the Jacob Zuma years. But to be fair, we're far from being the most corrupt country in the world. There's dozens of countries worse than us. According to one study called the Corruption Perceptions Index, which ranks 180 countries by corruption, we're the 70th least corrupt country, so majority of the world's countries are more corrupt than us. So yes, corruption is a big problem, but we're one of the least corrupt countries in Africa, which I guess maybe isn't saying much. But corruption didn't suddenly pop into existence when the ANC came to power. Apartheid South Africa did also have corruption. The National Party government did make sure that all of the best jobs, opportunities, schools, and neighborhoods were given to white people, particularly to Afrikaners, but white people in general. The main apartheid leaders were members of an Afrikaner secret society called the Broederbond. My pronunciation's a bit bad, but it was an exclusively Afrikaner Calvinist and male secret society dedicated to the advancement of the Afrikaner people. Apartheid was largely developed and implemented by Broederbond members. During apartheid, many prominent figures of Afrikaner political, cultural, and religious life, including every leader of the South African government, were members of the Afrikaner Broederbond, a secret society. That sounds like corruption to me. So yes, the National Party government was corrupt, the ANC government is corrupt, but I don't know if I would say that the ANC is vastly more corrupt than the National Party government. The other thing is crime. Now, my whole life, I've heard other white South Africans saying things like, oh, it's so dangerous in South Africa now, and there's so much crime these days, and South Africa used to be so much safer in the old days. I always just assumed this was true, but after researching, I found out that this isn't true at all. While it is true that crime has been going up in the last 10 years, the homicide rate in South Africa actually reached its peak in the early 1990s. Throughout the entire 1980s, homicide was more common in South Africa than it is now. Homicide was at its worst in 1995, but over the next 10 years, crime went down significantly, but it has been increasing again since the early 2010s. And South Africa today is the second most dangerous country in the world. But for decades, South Africa has been one of the most dangerous countries, even during apartheid. It's not since apartheid ended that crime has gotten worse. Crime probably has gotten worse in white areas, but in the country as a whole, crime is lower than it was during apartheid. According to the United Nations, South Africa is more developed now than it was in 1994. South Africa did used to be more developed than the average country, but now it's less developed than the average country. This isn't really because development in South Africa has gone down, it's more because other countries have developed faster than South Africa. The life expectancy has gotten a bit worse. In 1994, the average South African lived to the age of 63, and in 2021, the average South African lived to the age of 62. Incomes have also gotten a little bit higher. In 1994, the gross national income per capita was about $10,000 a year, and in 2021, it was about $13,000 a year. And the average years of schooling per student has also gotten higher. In 1994, the average person got 8 years of schooling, and in 2021, the average person got 11 years of schooling. The literacy rate has also gotten a bit higher. In 1996, only 82% of South Africans could read and write, and in 2021, it was about 90%. Also, our inflation rate is lower than it was during apartheid. In 2022, our inflation rate was 7%, and the previous year it was 5%. Our highest inflation rate post-apartheid was 11% in 2008, and our lowest inflation rate was 1% in 2004. Meanwhile, apartheid South Africa had a pretty bad inflation rate in the 80s and 90s. During apartheid, the lowest inflation rate was 11% in 1984. So think about that. Apartheid South Africa's lowest inflation rate was 11%, whereas post-apartheid South Africa's highest inflation rate was 11%. Inflation reached its worst in apartheid South Africa in 1986, where the inflation rate was 18%. So our 2022 inflation rate was 7%, and our 1986 inflation rate was 18%, probably because this was the year when America sanctioned apartheid South Africa. So inflation is definitely not as bad as it was during apartheid. Our economic growth rate is something that hasn't really changed that much. During apartheid, some years there was quite a lot of economic growth, and some years there was quite terrible economic growth. And same with post-apartheid South Africa. Some years have been better, and some years have been worse for economic growth. After apartheid ended, South Africa's economy continued to grow every single year until the 2008 global financial crisis. The worst year by far was 2020, where our economy declined by 6%, but that wasn't because of the end of apartheid, that was because of COVID-19. Now, I've listed most of the things in South Africa that have gotten better. However, there are two major things that have gotten worse. According to the World Bank, income inequality has become higher since apartheid ended. South Africa is today ranked as the most unequal country in the world. White South Africans continue to make a much higher income than other racial groups. Now, during apartheid, white people obviously made a higher income than all other racial groups in the country. Between 1993 and 2008, the average income increased for all racial groups: white, black, colored, Indian. However, white people still make a much higher income than all other racial groups. In 2008, the average white person made twice what the average Indian person made, 5 times what the average colored person made, and 8 times what the average black person made. So there still is very big income inequality between the races. Around half of all South Africans live below the poverty line. 56% of black people are poor, 27% of colored people are poor, 9% of Indian people are poor, and only 2% of white people are poor. Another thing is unemployment. South Africa has one of the highest unemployment rates in the world. In 1981, South Africa's unemployment rate reached 10%. By 1991, the unemployment rate reached 20%. And by 2021, the unemployment rate was 30%. Unemployment has been increasing almost every single year since apartheid ended. Inequality and unemployment remain two of South Africa's biggest problems. Another thing is electricity and load shedding. All South Africans are extremely pissed off with load shedding, and a few white South Africans I know have complained about how electricity access is so bad now. There used to be better access to electricity, and now we have load shedding. We never used to have this problem before. Electricity was never a problem before. And some people even tweet that the ANC has just completely effed up electricity. While there's no denying that the ANC has probably been involved in corruption with Eskom, access to electricity has actually gotten better since apartheid ended. According to the World Bank, when apartheid ended, only 58% of South Africans had access to electricity, and by 2020, 84% of South Africans had access to electricity. So access to electricity in South Africa has increased by 26%. I think I do need to remind white South Africans watching that, yes, for us, electricity access has gotten worse because of load shedding, but if we're looking at the country as a whole, access to electricity has gotten better. During apartheid, white South Africans had perfect access to electricity with no load shedding, while black people were extremely poor and the government gave them basically nothing. So load shedding is a new phenomenon that only appeared after apartheid, but when apartheid ended, only 58% of South Africans had access to electricity, and now it's 84%. So here's my conclusion. In terms of the economy, certain things have gotten worse and certain things have gotten better, but our economy as a whole has not gotten much worse than it was during apartheid. Yes, white people were probably richer back then than they are now, but the vast majority of the population, black people, were poorer back then than they are now, which means that the country as a whole has gotten better. So with economic issues, some things have gotten better, some things have gotten worse. But in terms of social issues, we are 100% better now than we were during apartheid. First of all, race relations. White people and black people are working together, going to school together, they're marrying each other, and the white youth and black youth mostly see each other as equals. And South Africa is definitely a much more free and democratic society. We are no longer a country with a severely bad human rights record. We're no longer a country where the law treats certain people as second-class citizens based on their race. We're no longer a country where the majority of people are banned from voting or banned from owning land. And we're no longer a country where people are regularly violently oppressed by the government for exercising their right to free speech. And I think that democracy, freedom, and human rights are more important than economic issues. We have a struggling economy that has a long way to go, but South Africa is definitely better now than it was during apartheid, because our people are now free.